Masechet Sanhedrin, Daf Lamed Bet. We begin the fourth Perek, and this is a favorite sugya of mine. A couple of years ago, I wrote an edition, translation, and extensive commentary on the first sugya of this Perek, and so I'm going to use this version today until we get to the second sugya. This has not yet been published, but I'm happy to share it with anybody who asks by email. So we begin. Echad dine mamonot ve'echad dine nefashot bederisha ubachakira. Shene'emar mishpat echad yeh lachem. Both for monetary cases and for capital cases, we have to do investigation and interrogation. Interrogation, chakira, that's the basic set of questions of where, when, who, what happened exactly regarding this crime or this incident. So chakira is fundamental questions. Derisha is further investigations. What color was the clothing of the perpetrator when he committed the act, and other incidental questions that are not as important. Now, how do you know that you have to interrogate the witnesses with both sets of questions, both for monetary and for capital cases? Because the pasuk says there should be one law, one standard for you. The pasuk right before actually makes reference to an animal that either causes damage or kills, and the consequences of that is, respectively, either one pays or one gets capital punishment. So since the pasuk right before refers to both monetary cases and capital cases, therefore the next pasuk that says there should be one procedure, one standard for all cases, is referring in fact to monetary and capital cases. And therefore, for all cases, whenever we have witnesses, we have to investigate them. Ma ben dineh mamonot ledineh nefashot. Now, although it's true, we just quoted this pasuk that says monetary and capital cases are the same, but actually, there are many differences. They are the same in the fact that you have to investigate the witnesses. But we're going to list here 8 differences in the Mishnah between the two types of cases. Number 1, dineh mamonot bishlosha v'dineh nefashot be'asrim ushlosha. For monetary cases, we only need 3 judges. For capital cases, 23 judges, which makes sense. The stakes for a capital case are much higher, so we have to involve more wisdom, more people, and to make sure that we get it right. In a monetary case, of course, we also want to get it right. But in a monetary case, if you get it wrong, you can always undo the judgment and repay what was paid. Capital case, if you get it wrong, there's no going back. Dineh mamonot potrin ben lizchut ben lechova, ve'dineh nefashot potrin lizchut ve'en potrin lechova. Regarding monetary cases, potrin, the usual translation of this is we open. That when they begin the deliberation, the first person to speak can speak both for acquittal or for guilt. For capital cases, the first person that speaks has to be for acquittal and not for guilt. That's the usual translation. However, Pinchas Mandel wrote an article showing that the word potrin in Tannaitic sources does not mean begin necessarily, but rather open or investigate, like to open a lock, to solve or investigate a difficult problem. And that must be the meaning here, because we're going to see that in capital cases, we begin at the end of the row with the least judge, and he speaks first so that he won't be intimidated by the higher up judges next to him. Now, if you're going to require that judge, we presume, can say anything he wants. He can say, well, I think guilty or I think innocent. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense. He has to say innocence. That wouldn't make sense. And for other reasons also, that reading doesn't fit with other sources. And therefore, the proper understanding here is that we're talking about a part of the investigator. There's 2 parts of the deliberation. One is a public part and one is private. Right after they interview the witnesses with Dirisha and Chakira and make sure that they line up, there is a public deliberation in which anyone, even students that are sitting in the rows or anybody else, can offer arguments, and that's the public one. And then, as we saw in a previous stuff, the judges send everybody out of the room. They send out the litigants, they send out the witnesses, and then there's a private deliberation. So what we're talking about here is the first stage of the public deliberation, and I have other sources to prove this. You can find them in the commentary if you want to read it. That is talking about the public deliberation, where in a capital case, when anyone can offer arguments, but only arguments for innocence. Because it's a capital case, we are looking to be lenient, to be merciful, because the worst thing would be to kill an innocent person. If we have to let a guilty person go free, it's also not so good. We don't want to do that, but it's better to let a guilty person go free than to give capital punishment to an innocent person. So that's an ideal of this Mishnah, and therefore, in a capital case, the judges will accept any suggestions for acquittal. So potrin is not open, but rather investigation. So investigation is only for acquittal and not for guilt. That's capital case. In a monetary case, it's equal if whoever wants to contribute something on this side or on that side. Because in a monetary case, we have to be totally fair. Because if we make this person pay, then he's losing money. And if we don't, then the other guy's losing money. So we, by being merciful to the defendant, then we're being not merciful. We're being mean to the plaintiff. So since we have two litigants here, so guilt and innocence is only relative to each other, and therefore we can't show favoritism to one or the other. And that's why in monetary cases, we investigate for both sides. Third difference, dinei mamonot matim al pi echad ben lezchut ben lechova, v'dinei nefashot matin al pi echad lezchut v'al pi shenayim lechova. In monetary cases, one wins the case by one. If it's 2 to 1, if there's 3 judges, 2 to 1 wins the day. It doesn't matter if the 2 say guilty and one says innocent, or 2 say innocent and one says guilty. You only have to win by 1. However, in a capital case, you can win by 1 for acquittal, but for guilt, you have to win by 2. So that's why if you have 23 judges, then if 13 say he goes innocent and 12 say guilty, then he goes innocent. That's it. He is innocent and he goes free. But the other way around, 13 guilty and 12 innocent, we do not yet kill him, because we don't want to kill a person based on just one person's judgment. Just flip one person's mind, and that life and death depends on one person. No, it's too much. Doesn't make sense. Rather, we have to deliberate more or add judges so that if there's two more saying guilty than innocent, only then does he get capital punishment. So there's another way in which we're going to be very careful not to kill an innocent person. Number 4, dinei mamonot machazirin ben lizchut ben lechova, v'dinei nefashot machazirin lizchut ben machazirin lechova. Regarding a monetary case, if new evidence comes out after, we discussed this in a previous daf, all of a sudden witnesses come from overseas that we didn't know about before, were not available before, and based on the new evidence, we want to change the verdict. We change the verdict. Either way, whether we said at first he's guilty and he has to pay, and then the new evidence comes, so now we say innocent, or he was innocent, now we say guilty, again, because it's equal. A loss to one person is a gain to the other, and vice versa. But in a capital case, once the verdict comes that says the person is innocent, then we do not bring him back. There is no double jeopardy. Even if new evidence comes out that shows that the person is guilty, we don't bring the person back. They remain innocent. Innocent in the law. Number 5, dinei mamonot hakom lamedin zechut v'choba, v'dinei nefashot hakom lamedin zechut v'hen hakom lamedin chova. Regarding a monetary case, everyone can offer arguments both for acquittal or for guilt. Whenever I say everyone, it means all the other people in the courtroom, including the bystanders, the students. There was rows of students that were there. And so, although the judges, of course, are the experts, but you never know. There might be a student there that thinks of something. And so they can offer suggestions of arguments both ways, because in monetary cases, we have to be totally equal. Whereas in a capital case, we only accept arguments for the benefit of the defendant for acquittal, but not for guilt. Dinei mamonot melamed chova, melamed zechut, v'melamed zechut, melamed chova, v'dinei nefashot ha melamed chova, melamed zechut, aval melamed zechut eno yachol lachazor ul-lamed chova, regarding monetary cases. If a judge at first argued for guilt, and then he changes his mind and says innocent, he can do that. Or he can change his mind the other way. First he thought he was innocent, and then he heard some other arguments and thought about it more, and then he says, "No, what? I argue for guilt." You can change your mind both ways. However, in a capital case, if someone at first thought guilty, he can change his mind towards innocence. But if one of the judges began arguing for innocence, he has to remain in that position, and he cannot argue for guilt. And this will ensure that there is going to be hopefully at least some of the judges that will have to try their best to argue for innocence, unless they all said guilty from beginning to end. And we already saw that law. If all the judges vote guilty, then the guy goes free, because nobody even tried to find an argument for innocence. And that means nobody tried the whole time during the whole deliberation, not only during the verdict of everybody voted guilty, and the entire time everybody only offered arguments for guilt, because anyone who offered argument for innocence, well then he would have to remain arguing for innocence. So we understand that law as well. The Gemara will discuss on a later daf whether this applies also to the verdict. Just because someone argued for innocence, does that mean they have to vote innocent? Let's say they change their mind and think he's guilty by the verdict. So it could be that this is only referring to the time of deliberation, not necessarily to the time of the verdict. Maybe at the time of the verdict they can change their mind. That will be a subject of discussion. Number 7, Dinei mamonot danim bayom begomrim balayla, v'dinei nefashot danim bayom begomrim bayom. Monetary cases have to begin during the day. Generally, the court is in session during the day, and not usually at night. So they begin during the day, but if it extends and they need a little more time, they can go into the night. As long as they started during the day, they can give the final verdict at night. However, monetary cases, you have to begin during the day and you have to end during the day. And we're about to see, it can't be the same day. So you can't just decide it at night. During the day, everybody's a notch clearer ahead. There's light out. You can see each other. You can see subtle expressions, see subtleties of other things. And so capital cases have to only be done during the day. Dinei maonot gomrin bo bayom ben lizchut ben lechova, v'dinei nefashot gomrim bo bayom lizchut u'bayom shela'acharav lechova lefichach and danim lo be'erev Shabbat ve'lo be'erev Yom Tov. Regarding monetary cases, you can conclude it that very day. You started in the morning at 10 o'clock, and then you're finished by 2 o'clock, so you can give the verdict the very same day. Because it could be it's not so complicated, and they figured it out in a short time. And you can do that both for guilt and for innocence in a monetary case. However, in a capital case, we can finish the same day if it's for innocence, right? We look at the case and we see the majority is for innocence. They can vote that very same day. And that's fine. But if it's going to be for guilt, in other words, they get together day number 1 and they end up saying guilty, we don't give the final verdict that day. We say, sleep on it. Everybody go home, think about it, maybe at night, while you're up at night or dreaming about it. You'll come back in the morning and you'll say, you know what, that my colleague who argued for innocence, I really see his point. And sometimes you realize things overnight and things look different the next day. And therefore, we're not going to give a final verdict for guilt on the very same day, but rather we will only wait till the next day, and then still, if there's a majority of 2 for guilt, only then will we give a verdict of capital punishment. Therefore, we will not begin a judgment of capital case on Friday or on Erev Yom Tov, because if it's for innocence, it can stop that day, but it might be for guilt, and then the court doesn't meet on Shabbat and Yom Tov, and then that's going to be a problem. So we're not going to begin a deliberation for a capital case on Friday or Erev Yom Tov in case they decide guilty and they have to go into the next day. That is the end of the 8 differences between monetary and capital cases that are listed in the Mishnah. that brings us to the Gemara that is going to ask a question about the very beginning of our Mishnah. And the Gemara says, the beginning of the Mishnah says that for monetary cases, like for capital cases, we have to investigate and interrogate the witnesses. Is that true, that for monetary cases you have to interrogate the witnesses and ask them even basic questions? Urmini, we have a challenge from a Tosefta that says, Shetar shezimano katu be'echad b'Nisan b'Shemita. ובאו עדים ואמרו, איך אתם מעידים על שטר זה, והלא ביום פלוני עמנו הייתם במקום פלוני, שטר כשר ועדיו כשרים, חיישינן שמא יכרהו וכתבוהו. The case is let's say a loan document, and there's a date in the loan document, and the date says this loan happened on the 1st of Nisan during the Shemitah year. This is going to be significant because all loans will be canceled at the end of the Shemitah year, at the end of Elul. So this is just 6 months before loans are canceled, and people don't usually, although they should, people don't usually lend out money just a few months before it's going to be canceled. Okay, keep that in mind. Anyway, witnesses come afterwards and they say, what are these two witnesses that signed this document? How could they have signed this document that they witnessed this loan? After all, those two witnesses that signed in the document were with us in Chicago at a bowl game on Rosh Chodesh Nisan during that Shemitah year. And so it's impossible that they were witnesses to this loan. That's the case, and the Tosefta rules that the loan document is kosher and the witnesses are kosher. We accept it. Why? Even though there's a discrepancy between the date in the document and the loan could not have been witnessed on that date. Why do we accept it? Because we suspect the possibility that they post-dated it and wrote a different date than it was. Really, this loan was earlier. Maybe it was back in Adar. But for some reason, they decided to put the date, even though it happened in Adar, and they wrote it in Adar. They wrote a later date. Now, a post-dated loan document, is valid, is kosher, because it just means that the lender is going to lose out on any property that he would have a lien on that is sold in between. The lender has a lien on all property that is in the possession of the borrower from the date within the document. So now he's losing that out. If he's willing to sign such a document and give up on his right to collect from those properties, even if they're sold, then that's okay. That's his right. Predated is no good, because then you're taking money from buyers, taking property from buyers that really doesn't have a lien on it. But post-dated is okay. Okay, that's what the Tosefta teaches. And here's the question. Ve'in salka da'atech ba'inan derisha v'chakira hechi chayshinan shema ichruhu ve'chitbuhu. If you think that you have to investigate and interrogate the witnesses, then how can you say, oh, well, maybe it's post-dated and it's okay? After all, part of the derisha and part of the chakira is when did this happen? And they're going to say it happened on the 1st of Adar. Well, then they say, yeah, but the date over here says in Nisan. And so any case like this is going to be automatically disqualified. And so the only way to say that it's okay is if we do not require investigation of the witnesses in monetary cases, in which case we don't have to ask them even these basic questions of when it happened. And since we don't have to ask them the question, then we can say, you know what, we accept your testimony and everything is, and the document is valid. So this is a proof that we do not do Derisha and Chakira in monetary cases. Okay, this is a good question. Before we answer the question, we're going to ask, why didn't you ask a better question? Right? If you're going to ask the question on our Mishnah here in Sanhedrin, why did you ask from a Tosefta, which is a lower level of authority? Why didn't you ask from a Mishnah? And now we quote a Mishnah in Masechet Shvi'it that says, Shitrei chov hamuktamin pestulin, v'mucharin kesherin. Loan documents that are predated are invalid. Post-dated ones are valid. invalid for the reasons that we just said. And now, if you require investigation of the witnesses and you're going to ask them about the date, because that's one of the fundamental questions that one asks during Chakira, then you're going to find out that they're going to say, oh, this day the loan happened, and they're going to give an earlier date. And then we're going to look at the document, it says a later date, and there's a contradiction. And anytime there's a contradiction, we're going to throw out the witnesses. And then it's not going to be a kosher document. So why would it be kosher? Rather, it must be that we can learn from this Mishnah here in Shavi'it that we do not require Dirisha and Chakira in monetary cases. So this is a better question because it's from a Mishnah, which is more authoritative to ask against our Mishnah here in Masechet Sanhedrin. So we answer this question. We're answering, why didn't we ask a better question? No, in fact, the question that we had from the Tosefta is a better question because Teleka lememar shema ichiruhu v'chitbuhu tela mera lishtare afilu achi kevan deshvi'it sofa mishametet machshirinan. That even though it says that the date in the document is Rosh Chodesh Nisan and a Shemitah, most people are not going to lend money on during that date because it's so close to when the Shemitah is going to cancel all loans. And therefore, in such a case, it's difficult to argue that it was post-dated because nobody would want to post-date their document in a way that will make it look suspect. If the loan really was earlier, let's say it was back in Adar, or even earlier in Tishrei or whenever, and they say, listen, you mind post-dating it? Wait, post-date it? You want me to write in Nisan? And then anyone looking at it is going to say, this is a fake document. Nobody lends money in Nisan of a Shemitah year. And so there's a good reason to say that in this case, we should do Dirisha and Chakira because there's something suspicious about this document. And yet the Tosefta teaches that we don't do Dirisha and Chakira, right? Even so, because the Shavi'it year only cancels loan at the end, so you still do have 6 months, and therefore it is possible that someone will lend money. In fact, it's a great mitzvah that they do that and they don't close their hands and be stingy because there's only 6 months left. And so it is possible that people will be generous and lend money. They're really just following the Torah law in doing so. And therefore, we do not require Dirisha and Chakira, not even in this case, because if you require Dirisha and Chakira, then there's going to be a contradiction, and then it will not be a kosher document. And so we quote the Baraita as the question, because the Baraita is stronger, in fact, than the Mishnah and Shavi'it, because the Baraita shows that we even forego Dirisha and Chakira, not only in a regular case, but even in a case where the document is suspect, because the date so close to the end of Shemitah seems suspicious. Even so, we forego Dirisha and Chakira. And so back to our question from against the Mishnah. So we say Mikol Makom Kashya. All right, now you explained why the question from the Braita was better than a question from the Mishnah, but still, either way, we have a question. We have these two sources that say that we do not do Dirisha, suggest that we do not do Dirisha and Chakira in monetary cases, and yet our Mishnah says we do perform Dirisha and Chakira in monetary cases. So we're going to have 3 answers to this. There's a mnemonic called Charpash, and this is the first. This is the letter representing the names of the sages. So the Chet stands for Hanina. Amar Rabbi Hanina, Devar Torah echad dine mamonot ve'echad dine nefashot bedirisha u'bechakira shene'emar. Mishpat echad yeh lachem. This is really from the Torah law on a Doraita level. One is required to do investigation and interrogation in monetary cases, just like in capital cases. As the Pasuk said, one law for all cases, which is what the Mishnah quoted. So our Mishnah here in Sanhedrin is expressing the Torah law. Umatam ameru dine moanot lo ba'inan derisha v'chakira kedei shelo tin'ol delet bifnei lavin. And what is the reason that the rabbis came? And amazingly, the rabbis overturned the Torah law, and they said that for monetary cases, we do not require investigation and interrogation of the witnesses. And why did the rabbis do that? So that doors will not be locked before borrowers. If we're going to require thorough interrogation of the witnesses, then when the lender comes to collect his loan, and let's say the borrower gives him a hard time. No, there never was a loan. I don't owe you, whatever. Okay, so now the lender has to bring witnesses. Fine. He brings witnesses, and now they're going to interrogate the witnesses, and they're going to ask him, what color was the money? What color was the purse? What was he wearing? What was the weather that day? Going to ask them a million questions, and it may very well be that the witnesses will forget some aspect. Maybe they'll even make a mistake on some fundamental aspect, and they'll say the wrong thing, and then they'll contradict each other, and then the case will be thrown out, and the lender will not be able to collect his money. If that happens even once to a lender, then the next time someone comes to borrow money, he says, I know what's going to happen. I'm going to lend you money. And then if I have a hard time collecting, I'm going to bring witnesses. I have witnesses. I'm doing it in front of witnesses. I'll do everything properly. And yet the Beit Din is going to give my witnesses a hard time and end up throwing out the case. You know what? I'm not going to lend money. And who suffers? The borrowers, because they won't be able to borrow money that they need. And therefore, the rabbis saw this problem, and they went so far as to overturn the Torah law, which they have the power to do because Beit Din hefker. And so they can say, you know what, this money, you deserve it. And they changed the procedure for monetary cases. And this explains the answer that the other two sources from the other Baraita and the Mishnah Shevi'it are talking about the Rabbanan level, where we do not require Derisha and Chakira, and that's why we accept that post-dated document, whereas our Mishnah is giving the Torah law. And now the Gemara asks a follow-up question. Ela me'ata ta'u lo yeshalemu. Based on this, if a judge makes a mistake, should they not have to pay? The question is as follows. I'm going to explain this according to Tosafot, not according to Rashi. I think this is the peshat of the question. And the question is as follows. Usually, if a judge makes a mistake, then what are the consequences? It depends if it's an expert judge or a lay judge. If it's an expert judge, then the judge does not pay out of pocket. However, if it's a lay judge, and he makes a mistake and he says, oh, you have to pay $100, then we leave the $100 to the recipient, and the judge himself has to pay out of pocket, because we don't really want lay people to be judges. And so now the question is, if the rabbis are so concerned that people will lend money and that they overturn the requirement for investigation of the witnesses, and so you don't have to investigate the witnesses, then perhaps in accordance with that goal, the rabbis also will say, you know what, we want lenders to lend out, and maybe they're going to have a hard time finding an expert judge. So let's make it easier for them to find judges by saying, you know what, you can go to a lay judge, and the lay judge won't have to pay, because usually lay people don't want to be judges, because if they make a mistake, they're going to have to pay out of pocket. So why don't the rabbis then also make a rule and say that if someone is a lay judge and makes a mistake, they won't have to pay out of pocket. And that way, it'll be easier for lenders to find judges to help them collect should they have a problem. And that will encourage lenders to lend out money. So should we do that? And the answer is no. If you allow that, then the lenders will certainly lock the door before borrowers, because they're going to say, well, what's going to happen if I need to collect money? I'm going to go to some lay judge. If the lay judge has no consequences and he won't have to pay out of pocket, and they don't really know what they're doing either, they don't know, they're not experts in the law, then they're going to give me a bad judgment, and they're going to tell the borrower that he doesn't have to pay, and I'm definitely going to lose money. So the lenders will not want to lend money if lay people are not held accountable, and that's why the rabbis did not change that law. When the the lender, if the lender should need a judge to help him collect the loan, then he'll go to an expert judge who is an expert and therefore is likely to give the right decision, or he'll go to a lay judge, but better if the lay judge is responsible. And so we'll either make sure to do a good job or we'll have to pay out of pocket anyway. And so actually that will help out the lenders even more. All that was the first answer. And now we get to the Rish, and that's Rava Amar Matnitin Dahacha Bedine Kenasot V'idach Behodaot V'halvaot. Rava makes a distinction within different types of monetary cases. He says, our Mishnah is talking about fines. When you're deciding if someone has to pay a fine or not, then you do investigation of the witnesses because you want to make sure that he really owes the fine. Just like in capital cases, we don't want to kill someone if they're not really guilty. In monetary cases, the stakes are less, but also we don't want to give a fine if he doesn't really have to, and therefore we follow the standard Torah law and require investigation of the witnesses. However, when it comes to admissions and loans, there Rava shares the concern that we just said in the name of Rabbi Chanina, that in a loan, if we're going to require investigation of the witnesses, then lenders are going to have a harder time collecting their loans, and then they won't want to lend out in the first place. And admissions is a consequence of loans. This is just, once you give a loan, and then if the other person admits. So if there are witnesses that said, we heard this person admit, and then we're going to that he owes money to the lender, and then we knock out the witnesses because we asked him too many questions, and then he's not going to pay, and lenders will suffer. So Rava says, our Mishnah is talking about laws of fines, whereas the other Mishnah, Shavi'it, and the Braita are talking about loan documents, which in fact they are talking about loan documents. Rav Papa Amar, and here is the peh, D'idi v'idi behoda'a v'halva'a, kan bedin merumeh, kan bedin she'eno merumeh. So the Papa says, all of these Tanaitic sources are talking about monetary cases, including loans and admissions. And the difference is whether it's a law that is deceptive or not. If a law seems that it's deceptive, then do dirisha v'chakira. Otherwise, don't. And those Papa is also accepting the basic outline that Rabbi Chanina said, that midoraita you should do dirisha v'chakira. The rabbi said, don't do it because we want to make life easier for the lenders. Okay, good. So in general, don't do dirisha and chakira to make life easier for the lenders, and that's what the other Mishnah and the other Braita are talking about. And that's if it's a standard case that the judges are looking at, and they said, yeah, it makes sense. Everything seems to be following the proper order, and this guy really looks like he's a true lender, and this borrower owes him money. And so then they go with the standard rabbinic procedure and they forego investigation of the witnesses. However, if the judges are looking at the case and they see something suspicious, something about the borrower, something he said, something that happened, and they say, you know what, we think or something about the lender, right? The lender is actually the one that has to be suspicious here, right? The lender seems not so upright. In that case, that's what our Mishnah is talking about. In that case, the judges should order further investigation of the witnesses because there's something wrong here. So don't fast track it and skip over the witnesses to help the lender because there's something suspicious. So we want to investigate fully. And although that will hurt the lender, well, that's okay because the judges are suspicious of the lender in the first place. And that's what our Mishnah is talking about, which is really quite fascinating. It's showing the power and the agency of the judges, that they're not simply blindly following some procedure, but rather the procedure itself is set up in a way to help the most people most of the time, and that means helping lenders so that ultimately borrowers will be helped by easing the process. But if the judges see that easing the process is a problem because it's a suspicious case, then they should reintroduce the Torah law and investigate and interrogate the witnesses. And Papa has a source for his answer. Kederesh lakish rameh. Keti besedek tishpot amitecha. Uchtiv sedek tirdof. Hakesad Resh Lakish, in a different context, asks, why do we have two pesukim? One in Vayikra that says, judge your fellow fairly. And the other says, justice, justice, you shall pursue, which sounds like you should run after justice. So another one is just like, follow the normal procedure. So which one is it? And the answer is, hakesad kan bedin mirumeh, kan bedin she'eno mirumeh. If it's a case that's deceptive, then you want to do sedek, sedek tirdof. And you have to go above and beyond the normal procedure. The normal D'Rabbanan procedure is to not investigate the witnesses. And so if you see something wrong, then judge, you have to do whatever you need to, right? Go get the original Torah law, figure out a way to make sure that justice will be achieved, even if it means altering the procedure that you usually do in other cases. But if you see that it's not a deceptive case, everything is following smoothly, then follow the normal procedure that the rabbis established, which is that you don't have to investigate the witnesses. Okay, now that we quoted these two Pesukim, now we're going to quote them again for a different application. So this is very interesting. This is a second application of Sedek, Sedek, Tirdof, and we transition from the first part to the second part through this shared Pasuk. Rav Ashe, and this is actually the Shin in the mnemonic that we had before, Charpash, is for Rav Ashe. Rav Ashe Amar Matitin Kedeshanin. Rav Ashe says, the contradiction between the Mishnah and the other sources is, as we said, pick any of the three answers that we just had before. That's not what Rav Ashe is coming to answer. Rather, is coming to give another answer to the contradiction between these two Pesukim. Kera'eh, echad ledin ve'echad lepeshara. And he explains that one of these Pesukim is for strict judgment, and the other one is for compromise. When a judge is going to suggest that litigants compromise, he's going to say, listen, why don't you split it 50-50, 70-30, which is not strict justice, as we saw on an earlier daf, because a strict justice says one person's right, one person's wrong, one person has to pay the whole thing, and the other person gets the whole thing. But when you come to compromise, there, to make for the sake of peace overrides truth in such a case. And so Rav Ashe says these two Pesukim are coming to answer that. Kedetanya. And he quotes a baraita as such that says, Sedek, Sedek, Tirdof, Uchtib, Sedek, Tishpat Amitecha, Echad Edin, Vechad Peshara. This baraita itself quotes both Pesukim that we just had, and it says on the one hand, it says, justice, justice, pursue, which sounds like you have to go above and beyond, and the other Pasuk in Vayikra says, judge your fellow fairly. So why are there two Pesukim? And the baraita explains that one Pasuk, the second one, is talking about strict justice. That's when you follow the normal procedure and you judge your fellow fairly. And the other pasuk that says run after justice, that is talking about compromise. As we saw in an earlier daf, there's some tension between strict truth and justice versus compromise. Compromise is good for peace because everybody is equally happy or equally unhappy, and we'll split it 50-50, 70-30, whatever everybody agrees on, and then since they agreed themselves, so everybody will be okay. So that's good for peace, but it does come at the expense of absolute truth and absolute justice, because absolute justice says, well, one person is right and one person is wrong, and they have to pay all or nothing. And so these two Pesukim come to give us the value of each of these, and says, on the one hand, yes, Sedek Tishpot Amitecha, that's talking about justice, but Sedek Tirdof is when you go above and beyond and you deviate from the normal procedure, and that to achieve a justice that is, well, it's a different type of justice. It's a justice that emphasizes peace rather than truth. That's what the pasuk means. Sedek, sedek, tirdof. And then the Braita goes on and gives an example. Before we look at this example, you'll note if you're following along in the Vilna printed edition, that in that version, the Braita only quotes one pasuk, sedek, sedek, tirdof. However, I can prove from many manuscripts, including, most importantly, a Cairo Geniza fragment. And you can see the Cairo Geniza fragment, which is the oldest and best and most authentic version of the Talmud Bavli, and it says here, Ketib, some of it is ripped, but you can see enough that it says, Tishpot amitecha, Uchtib sedek sedek tirdof. So you see it's clearly quoting both Pesukim, which makes absolute sense. The version that we have in the printed edition quotes only sedek sedek tirdof, and according to that, she has to explain, one sedek is referring to din, and the other, the repetition of the word sedek refers to peshara. But that doesn't flow with what came before, because here Rav Ashi said the two Pesukim are referring to, one is for din and one is peshara. It's the very same two Pesukim that we just quoted before, that Rav Papa quoted, when he quoted the Resh Lakish to back up his argument. So Resh Lakish quotes both Pesukim, and then Rav Ashi says, I agree with the answer to the two Mishnayot that you gave, but regarding the Pesukim, I have a different interpretation. So he has to quote the same two Pesukim. Otherwise, Rav Ashi does not flow easily from the statement of Resh Lakish that came right before. Okay, so that's one example of looking at the manuscripts, especially the Cairo Geniza, to help us read the Gemara much more smoothly. All right, so now that we understand that, let's look at the continuation. Kesad, what's an example of making compromise? Shete sefinot obrot benahar upagu ze bazeh. Im obrot shetehen tobaot. Bezeh achar zeh shetehen oberot. If you have two ships sailing in a river and they meet each other, it's a narrow river. If they both try to pass each other at the same time in the narrow section, then they'll crash into each other and both will sink, which will not be good for anyone. However, if one waits on the side and lets the other guy go through, and then he goes through, so they make a compromise and they say, you know what, you go first. No, you go first. Well, then they can both travel easily. It's true, one will have to wait a few minutes till the other one goes, but that's certainly better than drowning. And so making peace and a compromise is good. V'chen shenei gemalim sheyu olim b'ma'alot bet horon upag'u ze bazeh im alu shenehen nofelin bezeh achar zeh shenehen olin. Or if you have two camels that are climbing the steps of Bet Choron and they meet each other. The narrows of Bet Choron is a place that we know about. Here is Bet Choron. It has two sections, the lower part of the city and the upper part of the city. And they are connected by a very narrow road. Here is the upper and lower part. You can see this is the mountainous region. And here's a picture of, you can see, from an ancient road that is quite narrow. And here is another drawing of it. And you can see that these roads here are off of a cliff. Like when you're traveling in Israel often, like this is not an exact picture of the Bet Choron, but is something that you find in the mountainous region in Israel, that sometimes when you're hiking, right, if you take one wrong step, then you can fall down the cliff. Or when you're driving also, that happens nowadays. This was a very famous site, and it's mentioned in Sefer Yoshua, where there was a battle there, and in the book of Maccabees, there was a battle at the ascent of Choron. And again, Josephus tells us that, and this is worth reading, this is a battle against the Jews against the Romans in 66 CE, just 4 years before the destruction of the Bet HaMikdash. A Roman general came and he led the forces towards Bet Choron. Now, while the Judeans applied less pressure in open spaces, once the Roman had become crowded together in narrow spaces and the descent, those Judeans who had gone ahead were blocking them from reaching the exit route, whereas others were pushing those at the rear down into the ravine, and the whole Judean horde, having strung themselves out above the neck of the road, kept coating the column with projectiles. And there, with the infantry being completely stumped as to how to come to their own aid, the predicament was yet more precarious for the cavalrymen, the Romans, for they were not able to proceed in order down the road while being bombarded, and the ascent up to the enemy was not horse friendly. This way, and that were crags and ravines into which they fell and were obliterated. In other words, the Roman army, they had their horses and they had their strength, and out in the open, nobody could come up against them. But the Jews knew the terrain, and this road was a key road to get from the coastal area to the mountainous region. Right? There's not so many ways to pass, and so the Roman army, this is on their way back from a battle that they had on the mountains. They are traveling through this area, and the Jews then ambushed them, stopped the road above, didn't let them go the other way, and threw things down upon them until the Roman army were sent down the cliff. And this was a winning of a battle for the Jews, but also was an indication of losing the war, because the Romans were actually very upset about this, obviously, and they came back later on with a much bigger army, and they were not going to let this defeat go unheeded, and they came back, and this was really the beginning of the inevitable end of the war and destruction of Jerusalem. So this is the reference to Bet Horon here, I think, is on purpose and is actually indicating that when someone is very uncompromising, then it can actually lead to disaster. And we know that the rabbis, even at the time, like Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, wanted to be compromising and make peace with the Romans. He said, we know that ultimately Mashiach will come one day, and we will have our own sovereignty. But right now, the Romans are too powerful, and better to make peace with the Romans and live on and have the Bet HaMikdash and live Jewishly and do everything that we need to do, rather than fight, because we have no way of winning and we're not going to rely on a miracle. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and the majority of the rabbis wanted to be compromising and make peace with the Romans. And those that didn't, that said, no, right, it's us versus them. Well, what happens is, if you come to a clash in a narrow area like Bet Horon, someone will tumble down the mountain. And although it was the Romans in this case, but that was only temporarily. Eventually, the Romans came back and they destroyed Yerushalayim. So I think there is a subtle but definite reference here to the destruction of Jerusalem, and I'm going to back this up in a few minutes with another reference that's even more glaring than this one. Okay, back to the source, this Baraita. It says, if you have two camels and they both are trying to pass through this narrow area and they meet each other, if they try to pass at the same time, that's like two cars trying to pass each other in this narrow place, and one of them is going to fall down the mountain. But if one of them waits on the side where it's wider and allows the other one to pass through, and then he goes, then both of them can go in peace. Now, haketzad, according to the strict letter of the law, who has the right of way? Each one's going to say, no, I should go first. No, I should go first. And then it's going to cause disaster. So what do we do? As follows. Te'una v'she'ena te'una. If one is laden, one of the boats or one of the camels is carrying a lot of things, and the other one's not carrying anything, then tidache she'ena te'una mipnei te'una. Then the one that's not carrying anything, it can wait longer. Let it stay on the side. And the one that's carrying, it's more urgent, and let it get to its destination first. If one is close to the destination and one is far from the destination, then the one that's close to the destination, let it wait, because it's going to get to where it's getting soon and it has less risk. The one that is just starting out and has a long way to go, well, then there's a lot more risk. Let them go and get a good head start on their way. But what if they're equal? Both of them are equally close or equally far. Both of them are laden with packages. Then you should make a compromise, and one can pay the other. How much is it worth to you to wait a half hour? Oh, well, it's worth to me. I would take $20. I'll wait a half hour. How much would you take? Okay, so then pay the guy $20. He waits, and that way everybody is happy. So this is an example of making peace, of making compromise, and it means that there's no clear clear procedure, because who should go first? In some cases, it is clear there is right of way. When there's no right of way, then make a compromise. What's it worth to you? What are you willing to take? Oh, you're willing to take $25. Okay, so fine. I'll pay you $25 and you go. And that would be a proper way to solve these problems. And that's what Sedek Tirdof refers to. Tenor Banan, Sedek Tirdof, Helech Achar Betin Yafe, Achar Bi Eliezer Lelod, Achar Aban Yochanan Ben Zakkai Leberor Hayil. And now we have a third application of the same pasuk. So you see what's the running theme throughout this entire sugya is this pasuk Sedek Tirdof. The first application was when you see a case before you that's suspicious, then don't follow the normal procedure. Go and start investigating the witnesses and do what you have to get at the right answer. And the second application was to make a compromise. And the third one is physically travel to the place where you'll get the best justice. And that means travel to a proper court. If it's to Rabbi Eliezer in Lod, Rabbi Eliezer had a very respected court in the city of Lod. Or go to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai in Beror Chayil. We just mentioned Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. This discussion follows up on the end of the previous chapter that talked about if one litigant says, I want to stay here in the local court, and the other one says, I want to travel to the Bet Havad, the higher court. So who gets to win out? So this is following up and saying you should always go to a court of greater knowledge and greater authority. This is especially true because we just saw how much discretion the judges have, that they don't blindly follow procedure, but they're always attenuating and saying, well, we're going to ask more questions, less questions. So you really want judges who are experts, and therefore you should go to these places. Now we interrupt with another braita that seems to have nothing to do with the flow of this braita and the one that we're about to quote afterwards. Tana, kol rechaim beborni, shebua haben, or haner bebror chayil, mishteh sham. This says that if you hear the sound of a mill in the city of Borni, then that means shavua haben, a week for a newborn son. Week for a newborn son is a way of making reference to a berit milah. And this is referring to a time of persecution when the Romans, it doesn't say who it is, but actually this is a quote from Megillat Ta'anit. And in the context there, you can see it's referring to the Roman war around the year 66. Also, a second reference to the rebellion before the destruction of the Bet HaMikdash. And so when they said you can't make a Brit Milah, so they could not send out Brit Milah invitations and tell everybody explicitly because they'd get in trouble. Instead, he said, if you hear the mill, that means they're grinding wheat and they're making a food for a special meal, and everybody would know. Then that means that there's going to be Milah, and secretly they would come and attend. Or haner, if they saw a light of a lamp in the city Beror Chayil, that's the city that we just mentioned, where Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had a betin. If you see a light of a lamp in someone's window, then you'll know there's going to be a wedding there, and so you see it, and everybody will come secretly and celebrate the wedding, because there was persecution at the time that said anytime anyone gets married, the Roman general takes the bride for the first night, and they didn't want that to happen, obviously, and so they did their weddings in hiding. Now, why is this baraita here? Well, you can answer simply that you mentioned Beror Chayil. Oh, Beror Chayil, I know that place. And now we bring another source that happens to mention Beror Chayil, even though it has nothing to do with the theme. But that wouldn't make a lot of sense. So what? You found something else with Beror Chayil. Rather, I think this is another interpretation, another reference to the destruction of the Bet HaMikdash. And it's telling us, first of all, if you want to know why the Bet HaMikdash was destroyed, there's another Gemara parallel to this, a discussion in Masechet Baba Metzia that says Jerusalem was only destroyed because they insisted on adjudicating based on Torah law. Al shedanu ba din Torah. And then we ask about that. What kind of law should they administer? The Megista, right? Le dayano, should they adjudicate Persian law? Says no. This is what we mean. Ela ema shemidu dinehem al din Torah velo abdu lifnehem mishurat hadin, that they demanded the full extent of the law, and they did not go beyond the letter of the law to be generous, to be caring, to be compromising. And so we see that, number one, this is one of the causes of the destruction. As we said before, it's the uncompromising people that would have no compromise with the Romans and went and fought against them, and no compromise with their fellow Jews, because those zealots also killed fellow Jews and started a civil war. And so that's one reason for the reference to the destruction of the Bet HaMikdash. And the other one is because the way to redeem the people is going to be through Tzedek, that even though we will lose the Bet HaMikdash and we'll lose sovereignty and even access to Jerusalem and Judea, eventually after the Bar Kokhba revolt, the way to keep our nationhood, our identity, our values is going to be through proper justice that we can still do anywhere in any city that we go to. We can have a proper bet din and adjudicate at least our monetary cases in the way that we see fit and uphold Torah in that way. And that's precisely what the next baraita is going to teach us. Tenor Banan, Sedek, Sedek, Tirdof, Helech Achar Chachamim La Yeshiva, Sedek, Tirdof, follow justice. That means that you should always go to the sages in the yeshiva, wherever the greatest yeshiva is. Go there and learn from them and adjudicate your cases there. We mentioned these already. And now we continue and add more to the list. Achar Rabbi Yoshua lePeki'in, go to Rabbi Yoshua in the city of Peki'in. Achar Rabbi Akiva lebnei Berak. We know Rabbi Akiva was in Bnei Berak. Achar Rabban Gamliel leYavneh. Yavneh was the main center of rabbinic learning and meeting, and the Sanhedrin after Yerushalayim was destroyed. And Rabban Gamliel was the Nasi there. Achar Rabbi Matya leRomi. You even go to Rome. We had rabbis in Rome. And if you're in Rome, then you should go to Rabbi Matya in his yeshiva there. An interesting reference to Rome, that even in Rome, the Romans who destroyed the Bet HaMikdash are mortal enemies, right? You can go there, be in the heart of Rome, and as long as you have a yeshiva and a bet din, you can keep your identity. And that's the ultimate victory over the Romans. Achar Rabbi Chananya ben Terajon leSichni, Achar Rabbi Yosef leSipori, Achar Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera leNesibin, Achar Chananya ben Achi Rabbi Yoshua La Gola. And some of these places are in Eretz Yisrael, and some of them are outside of Eretz Yisrael. So go to Rabbi Chananya, if you're in the Gola, out in the diaspora in Bavel. Achar Rabbi leBet Sha'arim, to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. He lived in Bet Sha'arim. Achar Chachamim leLishkat HaGazit, and go to the sages in the chamber of hewn stone, which is on Har HaBayit. That's what was the seat of the Sanhedrin Hagadol when the Bet HaMikdash was up. And so this baraita is very beautiful in that, if you look at the beginning and the end, it's equating the Sanhedrin Hagadol in the Bet HaMikdash, and that was, right, the rabbis are placing it there because who oversaw everything going on in the Bet HaMikdash? Who oversaw even the Kohanim? It's the judges, the rabbis that were there and had a special chamber on the Bet HaMikdash itself. So you should go there when it exists. And when it doesn't exist, all right, second best, we'll go to the sages in the yeshiva, wherever they are. All right, and so even without the Bet HaMikdash, even without Jerusalem, we can pursue justice, and ultimately that will be our way of persevering and ultimately experiencing redemption. Sion b'mishpat tipadeh ve'shaveha bistaka, that Zion will be redeemed through judgment and through righteousness, and I think that is a main theme running throughout. So this is a fantastic introduction to this chapter, which is all about court procedure and monetary cases and capital cases, by first talking about the ideals of justice and pursuing justice. And sometimes that means following the strict procedure. And sometimes that means veering from procedure. Sometimes that means compromise. And ultimately, when the Jewish people are committed to tzedakah and mishpat, then that will be the road to their ultimate redemption. And now we move on to the second sugya. We go back to the regular Koren edition for this. Dine mamonot potrin vechule. The Mishnah said that when it comes to monetary law, the deliberation can be both for acquittal and for guilt. However, in capital case, this part of the deliberation that's public, where we invite everybody to submit arguments, they can only submit them for acquittal, but not for guilt. Hechi amrinan. What do the judges say during this part of the deliberation to invite everyone to offer arguments for acquittal? We're going to see about 5 different opinions. Amar Rav Yehuda, hachi amrinan lehu mi emar kedeka amritu. We tell the judges, the witnesses, in other words, right after the witnesses give their testimony, then the judges challenge them and said, who said that you are right? Maybe you're mistaken. Maybe you did something wrong, which is kind of intimidating to the witnesses, and that will make everybody think, oh, there's something wrong with the witnesses. Let's try to figure out where they went wrong. Amar le'ula chasminan lehu. Ula says, I don't like that because you are silencing the witnesses. It's too intimidating. Imagine these respected judges going and, these witnesses that just happened to be there at the scene of the crime, at the murder, and then saying, oh, who said you're right? Maybe you're wrong. So this is going to intimidate them too much. And we answer that, v'li chasmu, so what? So we'll silence the witnesses. What's wrong with that? Mila tanya, Rabbi Shimon ben Eliezer omer, masin et ha'edim memakom lemakom kedei shetitaref da'atan v'echseru bahen. We have a braita in which Rabbi Shimon ben Eliezer says that when we are investigating the witnesses, we move them from place to place to confuse them so that they will track what they're saying or contradict what they're saying. It's like a small form of torture, not like sleep deprivation or waterboarding exactly, but rather you put them here, then move them there, try to confuse them so that they'll lose their train of thought, and then the truth will come out. It could be physically moving them from place to place, going to tire them out and make them disoriented, or it can be asking them a question about this and then about that, not consistent questions in which they can give a consistent storyline, but rather asking them questions out of the blue. What about this? What about that? And then if you're making up a lie, it's harder to keep track of all the lies and how they put together. If you're telling the truth, then it's easier just to blurt out the truth. And so we're hoping that if they're lying and as they're trying to construct a lie, we're going to, by asking them a question out of context, then they will blurt out some truth and we'll catch them in their lie. So we see that we do challenge them, and that could cause them to be quiet and say, oh, I'm all confused, I don't know. So you see that we do treat them in a challenging way. So what's wrong with accusing them and saying, hey, maybe you're wrong? And the answer is, no, it's different. In that case, it's going to indirectly, they may come to be silenced because we're asking so many questions. But really, we're just asking them questions. Whereas here, we're doing it directly. We're just contradicting them and saying, who says what you said? Maybe you're lying. That's too frontal, in your face, direct contradiction that will silence them. That we don't do, and so we offer a second. Ula thinks that we should not do that. Ela Amar Ula, he offers a second interpretation, a second answer to what the judges should say. Hachi amrinan yesh lecha edim lazimam. They don't speak to the witnesses, rather they speak to the defendant. And after the witnesses say what they said, then we ask the defendant, do you have a second set of witnesses to prove that the first set are lying and they weren't even there on that day? And then everybody will get scared. The witnesses will get scared. Oh no, maybe there are a second set of witnesses, and that will prompt them and other people to come up with reasons to acquit. Amar le Rabbah, v'chi potchim b'zchuto shel zeh, shehi chobato shel zeh. But Rabbah challenges Ula. He says, are the judges really going to offer an argument that will be for the acquittal of the defendant? Is true, but it could lead to the liability of the witnesses, because if they are found to be edim zomemin, then they will be killed themselves. And I understand the judges should try to be merciful to the defendant. Yes, we see that throughout, and try to find a reason to acquit. But by doing it in this way, you're going to end up possibly killing the witnesses themselves if they are found to be edim zomin. So, I mean, if it happens, of course, that's the law, that it happens, but the judges shouldn't be involved so directly in fishing for edim mizimim. So we ask a question on that, Rabba's question. Will it really be to the liability of the witnesses? We have a Mishnah in Masechet Makot that says, Edim Zomin are not killed unless the verdict was already issued. If the court said a verdict, this guy's guilty, and after the verdict, before the capital punishment was actually given to the defendant, then Edim Mizimim come and say, the Edim that said he's a murderer actually were with us in a different place on that day. Only then do we give the capital punishment reciprocally to the Edim, to the first set of Edim. Then, yes, they will be killed. But if you're still during the time of the deliberation, and right now we're talking about the deliberation, which is before the verdict. So even if Edim Mizimim come and say, you were not there on that day, you were in a different place, still we would not kill the witnesses because the verdict didn't happen yet. So you don't have to worry about that. And so we fix Rabba's question and we say, Hachi Amina, Ailu Shatik Hai Adim Igmar Dineh, Umayte Adim Umezim Lehu. If the defendant would be quiet in the meantime and wait until the verdict was issued, then then if the Mizimim came then and found that, when we find that the first set of witnesses are Edim Zomin, then we will kill them. And so this is a problem. The judges should not, even at the time of the deliberation, open up and offer the possibility that, maybe there's some witnesses, edim mizimim, because although you're right, if he brings it at that point during the deliberation, then the first witnesses will not be killed. But he might wait and say, you know what, these guys, look how they're lying against me, and he'll wait till the verdict is issued, and only then he'll bring the witnesses. So potentially, the judges can cause the witnesses to be put to death, and so they're not going to do that. Although we want to help out the defendant, we're not going to do it on account of possibly causing the killing of the edim. Ela amar Rabba, so he has another answer. Amrinan le yeshcha edim lahachishan. We ask the defendant, do you have witnesses to contradict the first ones? Witnesses that contradict, don't say, oh, you were in the baseball game in Chicago with us on that day. That's edim zomin, and they get punishment. But rather, witnesses that contradict will just say, no, it wasn't this person that killed him. We saw it was someone else that killed him. So they just contradict some detail of it, but they're not saying anything about the witnesses themselves. If there are edim machishim, then we do throw out the original testimony. We're not going to kill the person based on the first set of witnesses because second set of witnesses contradict some aspect, but there's also no punishment to the first set of witnesses that's not edim zomemin, and so that's a good thing to do. To ask the defendant, do you have any other witnesses that contradict the first ones? Another answer, Rav Kana amar midibrechem nizdaka peloni. We say a blanket statement. The judges, after they hear the testimony, they say, based on your words, we can conclude that the defendant is acquitted. Now, not that they have any specific reason to say so, but by saying that across the board, then everybody will say, oh, I wonder why. Why are they saying acquitted? And that will prompt everybody to think of some arguments or some proofs why he should be acquitted. And also give some doubt to the witnesses, like, oh, he heard from us based that it's acquitted. Oh, what's wrong with what we said? So it's not as directly confrontational as the first answer, hey, you guys are lying, but rather saying, oh, we can conclude that based on what you said, that he's acquitted. Abaye says that the judges tell the defendant, listen, if you didn't commit murder, don't worry, right? We will find out the truth. And then that will also prompt everyone to say, oh, if you didn't, he doesn't have to worry. Maybe, in fact, the witnesses are not, because right after the witnesses speak, probably everybody there is like, oh, look, they just said, look at this testimony. And everybody's assuming that the witnesses are right, because that's the last thing you heard. And they might be very convincing. And so then the judges say, everybody calm down. Maybe he's innocent. Let's try to think about that. Rav Ashi amar, kol mi sheyodea lo zechut yabo v'yilamed alav. Rav Ashi says, the judges say directly, anyone who has any reason to suggest why he should be acquitted, let them come and suggest it, and that will invite everybody to come and do so. So that's what the Mishnah means, that we investigate potrin for acquittal in a capital case. We could do so in any of these ways. Tanya kiveteda Abaye v'Rava. There's a braita that supports the answer of Abaye and Rava, that we say, listen, if to the defendant, if you didn't kill, don't worry, we will get you off the hook. Rabbi Omer, im lo shachab ish otach, im lo satit. So this baraita quotes Rabbi Yehuda Nasi quoting a pasuk regarding sotah. In the pasuk it says, if no man, the judges tell the woman, if no man has lain with you, if you did not sin, you did not go astray, then don't worry. This bitter water will have no negative effect on you. In fact, you'll go back with your husband and everything will be okay. So we tell her that, and that is a capital case. And so you see, that's exactly what we do here. We say to the defendant, don't worry, if you're innocent, everything will be okay. So this is a good proof for Abaye and Rava. For based on this pasuk in Sotah, we can learn that not only in Sotah, but in all cases of capital punishment, we deliberate the public deliberation. We examine for acquittal and not for guilt. Baruch Adonai leolam. Amen ve'amen.